After waiting almost 2 years and paying an extraordinary amount of money, I finally have my hands on my 5-tool Prusa XL, although somehow it still feels like it's too soon, as this 3D printer has significant issues. Today, my honest experience and my recommendations for what I think is needed to create light at the end of the tunnel. We're going to jump right in because there's so much to cover in this video, including the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll start by covering what the XL is and the context behind my purchase. In a nutshell, the XL is a new large format printer from Prusa, and not only is it their first big printer, it's also their first that's a Core XY. But the key point of difference between the other machines and anything else available is that it is a tool changer. We can see here we can have up to 5 heads that it can change between, each with their own dedicated roll of filament. I first learnt about this printer in late 2021 in a great video from Joel of 3D Printing Nerd fame interviewing Joseph Prusa. Primarily, I was pretty excited to see a new tool changer option from a company I trusted. Other innovations are a segmented bed where only the part that you need will heat up, and a new extrusion system called an extruder that promises no slip, but most importantly has an inbuilt load cell, meaning that the user no longer has to calibrate the Z offset to get perfect first layers. The printer was quite expensive, but it wasn't due for some time, so I put in a pre-order and thought I would save up while I waited. Obviously there's been some challenges and supply chain issues have accounted for some of the delays. But as more and more updates came out, it was clear things were going to be pushed back further and further. In January 23, Prusa were preparing to ship the first XLs, but only single tool models. Time marched on, more delays were announced, and the Prusa Mark IV was shipped instead. And then finally in late October, it seemed everything was about to happen with the multi-tool models. So the timeline had blown out, but for me at least, so had the cost. A number of factors just weren't on my side. I had the initial deposit of $285 back in November 21, and then the balance of the payment ballooned out to $6,700 due to me upgrading to the pre-built model, and also very expensive freight to Australia. But also, when I went to pay, Prusa's web store was broken in terms of my address, and as I transferred money back and forth trying to get it to work, my bank stung me with $192 of fees. And then, once it had finally been sent, I was hit up by Australian Customs for an import duty of $750. That gave me a total of 7,932 Australian dollars, which currently converts to just over 5,000 US. Before this, I had been a Prusa customer 3 times. 2 Mark IIIs, one of which I built on my channel and is featured quite a bit, and another one that I was responsible for at my school, and both of these were excellent, reliable workhorses. And then a couple of years later, I purchased a Prusa Mini, and if you watch that video, you can see I was really optimistic at the start, but in the second half of the video, after I'd actually used the machine, it was clear that it wasn't up to scratch. My unit was plagued with extrusion issues as well as stringing. For me and other early adopters, that printer was unreliable, and I had to open it up and modify it to fix the problems. I was worried, but I thought that surely enough time had passed for them to make sure that everything was going to be right. And so finally a week and a half ago, the box arrived and I was ready to answer that question. And before we get to my unboxing and assembly, I'd like to give a shout out to Robert Cowan, whose videos I watched while I was waiting for my printer to arrive. They were really informative, and he was also kind enough to help me out with a few questions I had during my build. I really need to point out how enormous and heavy this thing is, the printer being around 35 kilograms. With that in mind, I'm glad they had this special box to help with the lifting. Everything was packaged well and there were no damaged components, and I have to give credit to Prusa here for minimizing the amount of foam they had in their packaging. In fact, the most foam came inside the extruder boxes, but even so, this is way less than typical 3D printers have. What you're seeing here is the pre-assembled printer, but to keep the box within a certain size, there's still some work you need to do yourself. It's mostly straightforward and includes connecting and bolting on the LCD at the front, and then installing the tool posts one at a time along the back. Each of these only have a single bolt to hold it to the frame. I'm pretty adamant this is a design flaw, and I'll explain why later. It was at this point that I ran into an issue with the instructions, which were generally pretty good, but the change in components recently had caught me out. For instance, step 12 and 13 was redundant as these were pre-assembled for me. That was a win, but then I got to my antenna and found it didn't match any of the hardware described in the manual. Furthermore, it didn't fit into the printed part that came with the kit if I followed the instructions to the letter. But worst of all for me was how ambiguous this step was here. The manual shows 2 potential positions for the antenna, in the center and on the corner, but it doesn't say whether I'm choosing which I want or whether certain specs of hardware need a certain position. And there was no socket or cabling in either of these spots on my machine. So I jumped onto the live web chat and Rodolfo was very friendly and helped me eventually solve the problem. However, it took over an hour to solve this one simple problem, and I was left with a strong impression that the workers are spread pretty thin at the moment, based on the length of the queue to get on and the slow response times. I was also told that the part in the kit was wrong, so printed another myself, only to find that dimensionally it seemed to be identical to what was supplied in the kit, but much nicer quality. Like other Prusa machines, the printed parts don't really look that great. After all of that, I just used the original part and ignored the assembly instructions in terms of the washer order, installing the antenna in the middle, as I had learned that all of the latest versions required this. With all of the tools plugged in and the cover back in place, I connected the PTFE tubes, attached the extended filament holders, and proceeded with installing the actual print heads. They slot into position, are bolted to a cable guide, and then we plug in the connector and the other end of the PTFE tube to complete our setup. I turned on the printer to start the self-calibration, typically a real strength of Prusa machines. Most of these processes are completely automatic, but there's some that you have to do manually, like the docking calibration that needs to be repeated for each tool. This is pretty straightforward. You just remove and loosen some components, dock the tool manually, sliding the pins sideways to lock them in place, and then guided by the LCD, start to tighten as the machine homes and works out the exact position where it needs to dock. It will then do a little rehearsal to test everything's in the right spot before moving on to the next tool. An unusual step was installing this probe in the bed. For me, it then took around 15 minutes for each tool to probe the nozzle on this and locate its exact position. In total, all of the calibrations took somewhere around an hour. After loading filament, it was time for a pre-slice print, and I went for this large first layer test. This print bed is 360mm squared, and the whole ABL system did a great job as this first print was flawless. My next step was setting up the Wi-Fi, which is a little unusual, requiring you to go back and forth between your computer and the printer, a bit clumsy but also straightforward. I then decided to update the firmware to the latest alpha release. This is significant because it not only supports input shaping, but has a new compressed binary G-code format to help alleviate some of the issues with slow upload speeds. To update, you simply put the firmware file on the flash drive and press reset, and the flashing will take place automatically. I never uploaded with the old firmware, but the speeds for the new firmware were plenty acceptable for me. It is only in alpha and I did experience some bad freezes. On 3 occasions so far, the printer would just pause while heating up the extruder at the end of the start G-code sequence. The heaters are turned on, but they never seem to reach the target temp. Not ideal, but it is an alpha release and I'm sure they'll squash this bug in the future. I sliced the 3D Benchy using the default 0.2mm fast profile, and I have to say I was surprised that this print took 55 minutes despite this printer having a 0.6mm nozzle. The quality is just okay considering it's that slow, and you can see some stringing throughout despite this being a brand new roll of Prusa filament on their pre-assembled printer using their pre-made slicing profiles. The normal bow line is there, and there's also a little bit of extrusion breakdown on the top of the chimney that I imagine is related to the seam and perhaps input shaping. This Benchy is reasonable but nothing amazing, particularly for 55 minutes. This printer is also not the quietest. Unlike other fast machines that have really loud fan noises, that's not the problem here, but rather quite loud stepper motors. Also, as you heard, the tool change makes quite a clunk, which is satisfying when you're standing in front of the printer, but sounds like a nasty collision from the next room. So it's not a fast printer, even with that input shaping firmware, and it's certainly not a quiet printer either. But I can look past all of that if it lives up to its promise and does multi-extrusion as advertised. I started with this multicolor sushi by Mosaic Manufacturing, and it's an easy print because all of the color changes only happen at the top. For my first effort, there was quite a lot of stringing, some missed extrusion, and some blobs mixed up. For my second attempt, I switched to white instead of grey filament and lowered some of the temperatures. That reduced the stringing a little bit, but as you can see, there's still some blobs of colour that have come loose and mixed through the white. But in this print at least, the end result was still not too bad. So I thought I'd move on to this Marlin remix by Sippus. I printed a bunch of these in a recent video about reducing waste on Bamboo Lab AMS prints. And while that system is slow and does produce a lot of waste, there's no denying how flawless the prints are. So I loaded up the model, scaled it, and matched the print settings from the Bamboo Lab video, and I also loaded up the exact same filament, minus the black, which I left the new roll of Prusa in for. And boy was I disappointed when I saw this result. The wipe tower had come loose, but there was blobs all over the print and plenty of stringing too. Some of the blobs could be pulled off or cut off by hand, but really this is a pretty shocking print for a machine set up for multi-extrusion. Next, I tried one of the 5-color pre-sliced models on the USB drive, and that was also a disaster. As you can see, there's bits of filament contaminating each color, but there's also a little layer shift there, and I stopped the print at that point because of a problem with the tool changer. It turns out either a collision, or maybe just that single tool post fastener bolt vibrating loose, had rendered tool 5 inoperable. I spun the machine around and tightened it, this time using my own tool that would let me apply a lot more torque, and following that I ran the calibration again. At this point, I'm not gonna lie, alarm bells were ringing, but maybe it was just me. So I headed to the Prusa GitHub and forums to learn more. And unfortunately what I found wasn't pretty and matched my experience quite well. There were plenty of users participating in threads with the same type of issues, lots of stringing, loose blobs coming off, and quite poor final results. But in these threads, the community was banding together to try and find solutions, so I got to work. First up was addressing the stringing, and I printed this simple tower, trying different results, my own experimentation, as well as what people were recommending. And honestly, I didn't really make much ground. I put the PLA profile down to 195, which helped a bit, but it was inconsistent, and this matched what people were saying on the forum. So instead, I concentrated on tool changer performance, and as you can see, I printed that marlin many times, and there were some absolute shockers as I experimented. There was one very promising solution posted on the forum by a channel called 3D Print Dogs, and their video did an excellent job in breaking down the problem and supplying a possible fix. They pointed out that for each tool change, there was a 2mm vertical lift on top of the model, and that would leave behind a little vertical spike, which would later break off and deposit itself elsewhere. They also identified, like I had noticed, that the nozzle seemed to be a magnet for collecting molten filament, and eventually this was always going to come off and ruin the model. Their solution was simple and elegant. Modify the filament NG code so that the tool head would travel to the back of the printer before doing the vertical lift. No more vertical spike and hopefully cleaner prints. I tried this fix and initially my results weren't much better, but I did come back to it later on. Instead, I turned my attention to the slicer and the tool change G code, and we can see we have this P0 code, which was probably for stowing the previous tool, and then a T code for picking up the new one. So I headed to the Prusa page that lists all their G codes, and there was nothing for P codes. There was a section for T codes, but it didn't cover any of the arguments I was seeing in Prusa Slicer. In the start G code, I then found something valuable, an M217 G code, which according to the comment would set the tool change Z hop. But again, searching Prusa's documentation yielded no results. The closest thing I could get to answers was searching through the firmware source and finding the M217 file, and that got me a brief description of each of the parameters. But using that method, I still couldn't find answers about the P or T codes and all of their arguments. In particular, this L2, which I theorized was a lift of 2mm, with L0 returning to the printing position. I would have to use trial and error, but neither Prusa Link nor Prusa Connect have a way to manually send G code to the printer. I did manage to connect via laptop with Prontoface, but I couldn't get much information, and the printer's firmware crashed when I started trying to send commands. So I ended up writing my own custom G code files, trying to experiment with variables back to back. This was a bit hit and miss because I could only really observe instead of actually measure, but as far as I know, I eventually cracked it. I hard-coded the M217Z value to 1, and I matched the L value at 1 for when the tool is stowed, and this seems to give consistent results. And 1mm was the best lift compromise I found when testing various heights. I tried the suggestion that the retraction between tool changes should be quite large, and that will completely eliminate oozing and not need an ooze tower, but unfortunately that suggestion didn't work for me. One thing that definitely helped was adding a physical nozzle scrubber, and this designer Surfilex 2000 actually has a whole range of printable upgrades for the XL. Yet more money spent on the brushes, and my hardware store only had carbon steel or nylon. I've ordered the softer brass, but I stuck with the nylon for now just to prevent any damage. We used T-nuts to hold the mount in front of each tool. Brush simply drops in from the top, and there's an M3 bolt in the bottom to adjust the height if necessary. There's also this little collection bucket which slots easily into the extrusion. You can then use the LCD menu to manually pick up and drop the tools, testing the alignment and adjusting if necessary. Do these brushes work? Absolutely, and I figure every bit of filament they catch is less filament that can contaminate and ruin the print. And besides what's caught in the bristles, we also have some that falls into the collection tray, so very worthwhile. The lower Z lift plus the brushes were definitely helping, but I had my biggest breakthrough from a typo. I decided to try the 3D Print Dogs method again, but put in X1 instead of E-1, and that's why you're seeing the print head dart into the rear left corner on each of these tool changes. But nonetheless, it seemed to work better than ever, removing the dripping nozzle well away from the print, and that gave me my cleanest result thus far. It wasn't perfect, there were still blobs of filament, but fortunately they were mainly stuck to the outside and I could remove them by hand. After this cleanup, I had a respectable but not exactly fantastic result. I sliced this refined gear bearing myself, allowing me to implement my tweaks, and it was much cleaner than before, at least until the wipe towel fell over. Concerningly, there was a layer shift in the middle, a repeated problem for my printer as well as others on the forum. But still, I was finally making some progress. I returned to an old favourite dual material model, and again the print quality was much better, at least until it was knocked off by these blobs collecting on the model. So I scaled it right up and probably got my best print so far. There was 1 or 2 blemishes, but really this one was quite clean. Feeling more adventurous, I sliced this Tavern by Mosaic Manufacturing. I used 5 different colours for this one, and there was some more wisps and stringing, but most of it could be removed by hand afterwards. Only one blob was properly embedded and I can't remove it completely. Unfortunately on this print, layer shifts were an issue, and there were 4 in total, although they're fairly well hidden by the design of the model. Now it was time to test multi-material instead of just multicolour, and I modified one of my own designs to have a TPU grip embedded in a PLA handle. Now this TPU is quite old and I would have expected more stringing than I saw here. The wiper brush for that nozzle did a tremendous job in catching loose bits, and apart from the inconsistency in this seam between the 2 materials, I'd have to say this was my best print to date. This model is satisfying to hold because the grip is just that little bit squishy, and it's nice to print all of this on the one machine in one process. Finally, a quick support test using PETG to support PLA. I first tried to use PETG as an interface layer, but I had a tough time getting it to stick to the PLA, and I guess that's the point. So instead, I used PETG organic supports that wouldn't touch the main model until the supported section. They separated cleanly, however I didn't have a wipe towel on for this, so the blobbing is not very good. So after a significant amount of experimentation and some community fixes, I got some reasonable prints. And I'm sure you'll agree that's just not good enough. For years now, the whole point of buying a Prusa printer is that it just works. They're more expensive than other machines, but the idea is you're getting something that's thoroughly tested, and the ecosystem that goes with it, including their slicer and all of the pre-tuned profiles. And if you're interested, you can also use their in-house filament. But what does that matter if the sum of all of this is just average prints, and they're particularly average given how much this machine cost and how big the delays were. You would think during this time they would have a lot of time to iron out all of the bugs. And I know some people will never blame Prusa, but instead blame people like me. But the truth is, I calibrated this thing over and over. I went through the forums looking for solutions, and that's where I found these type of problems were being experienced by a number of people, with some of them trying to get help from Prusa support for some time now, but without any success. Some people will blame my filament, and that's an idea I absolutely reject. After all the tests on the XL, I put the exact same filament back on the A1 Mini, and what do you know, a perfect marlin without any stringing. This is not a problem with mine or anyone else's filament, this is a Prusa XL problem. And if you need further proof, even the test print that came with the pre-assembled printer has stringing all through it, and presumably that was printed in perfect conditions with perfect filament back at Prusa headquarters. Compared to the competition in the Just Works category, this Prusa XL feels a little unpolished and a bit out of date. I can live with the printed parts on the machine, but their appearance doesn't really inspire confidence, and their options for web control also lack features compared to the competition. Even simple things like setting up a webcam, which is plug and play for Clipper, or a factory option for Bamboo Lab, with the XL are going to require me to use an old mobile phone or buy a Raspberry Pi so I can add a Pi camera or use a USB webcam. And according to the comments at the bottom of the page, you can't even have a continuous video stream. I thought I'd try this myself, but it just didn't work with an old mobile phone. It did work with my current phone, albeit with only a 10-second refresh rate. I suppose it's better than nothing, but it does make for a pretty ordinary experience. And if you don't leave the screen permanently on the phone, the image will just stop updating. And if you were thinking about Octoprint, well, that's currently broken too. I think it's reasonable to expect that for this much money, the flagship Prusa XL comes with a webcam just like its competitors. As annoyed as I am, I still want Prusa and the XL to succeed. Not just for me and all of the other people that spent all this money, but I think that a company like Prusa, with their commitment to open source, needs to have a strong presence in the 3D printing market. With that in mind, I'd like to finish by touching on what the Prusa XL does do well and my recommendations for what they can do in the short term to improve the experience significantly. What works best for me is everything related to the bed. It's split into 16 heating elements and only the area you need will heat up, which will save on power. The underside of the bed has some pretty extensive wiring, so I'm hoping nothing ever goes wrong here, but overall it's a welcome feature, especially when you consider that ABL probing only happens in the small area that's required. And credit where credit's due, that ABL system with automatic Z offset setting was absolutely flawless and I always had a perfect first layer. I also quite like the design of the tool changer mechanism. I like the way it doesn't use electromagnets and it simply uses the motion of the print head to push on the pins to lock everything in place. This seems to make a rock solid connection, and to be honest, I just really like watching it too. Quality issues aside, the process is efficient as you would hope. This dice tower took a bit under 9 hours and the ratio of model filament to waste filament is quite good. To produce the same print on a Bambu Lab X1 carbon with AMS, we're talking about 4 times the print duration and more than double the filament. Prusa Slicer continues to be a very innovative piece of software with trickle down to Bambu Studio and other forks like Orca Slicer. Bonus points for having greener packaging than the competition. The self-tests and calibrations are also quite good. And I still think one of the best selling points for Prusa printers is the safety net of that 24/7 live web chat support. But onto my fixes and wish list, and here are 10 things that I think would make a pretty big difference when added up. Firstly, the documentation is expanded for the XL specific G-codes. And it's not just what I showed earlier. There's G-codes for setting which part of the bed will be used, and these are also missing from the documentation and should be added as soon as possible. On this topic, there's room for refinement in the start G-code. This is a very messy printer in terms of loose bits of filament accumulating, and this is added to with every print. The start G-code has the nozzle sit at 170 and everything sits for 90 seconds while absorbing heat. During this time, the nozzle is slowly oozing filament. The bed probing begins soon after, and typically some of this blob comes off on the bed, but other bits remain on the nozzle to later dislodge on the print. Also related to this are the time estimates. At the start of each print, there's an elaborate sequence where each tool that will be used will be picked up and then redocked, the previously mentioned 90-second absorbing heat time, the time taken for ABL probing, and then there's each of these prime lines which happen individually with the tool heads heated up one at a time. It all takes 10 to 15 minutes. However, it doesn't seem to be taken into account in the slicer, and I feel like it would be more honest and transparent if it was, just like on Bambu Lab machines. Something that should be easy to fix but make a big difference is a bug with the wipe tower base. A few times the tower dislodged for me and destroyed print quality. For larger models that use a bigger wipe tower base, everything works as intended. But for smaller towers, we can see that the brim isn't actually connected to the model. And even if we increase the width of the brim, it still doesn't touch and it's probably going to come loose. A quality of life feature would be better communication between the printer and the slicer when it comes to filament color and type. As you insert filament, the printer will ask you what type it is so it can set the temperature correctly. And we know this is stored because it comes up on the screen whenever you start a print from the LCD. What I'd like in Prusa Slicer is a button like we have in Bambu Studio, where we can click and collect all of the information from the printer to speed up slicing. Another quality of life feature would be adding all of the nozzle temperatures to the interfaces. The most we can have on the LCD is having the 5 tools display their current temperature one at a time in the corner. But surely they could all be displayed at once across the bottom, even if this part of the interface had to spread to 2 lines. The same goes for the web interfaces. We can only ever see the current nozzle, and even on this fancy Prusa Connect telemetry graph, I want to be able to see the temperature of each tool so I can tune things like idle temperatures. Something really obvious is that the team further tuned parameters to improve stringing. There's no way this should ever be an acceptable first multicolor print, using filament that works great on all of my other printers. Some of you might be thinking that the 0.6mm nozzle probably doesn't help with stringing, and I've got a bone to pick here too that should be an easy fix. I can't find any mention of the nozzle or nozzle size anywhere on the store page, and given 3D printers typically come with a 0.4mm nozzle, I think it's important to disclose that this one is different. Number 9 I think is the most important here when it comes to multi-tool print results. It's purely software and needs to be implemented into Prusa Slicer, and that's a tower to print to tower logic. Currently, after a tool change, the new filament will be deposited first on the wipe tower, and then a short retraction and travel move will take place to transition to the model, and neither of these seem to pose any problems. What I'm proposing is that after the model has been printed, instead of us having to insert custom G-code, the nozzle would do another short retraction and travel move back to the wipe tower to deposit a little bit more filament and keep the nozzle clean. I think this simple change in slicer logic will probably fix most of the problems with stringing and blobs when it comes to tool changing. So to recap, for each color, we would start on the purge tower and then head to the model and print everything for that color, before returning to the wipe tower to make sure the nozzle is clear before changing the tool. Finally, if that still doesn't work, Prusa need to get serious about adding a nozzle scrubbing system, whether it's a system similar to what Bamboo Lab printers have, or a system similar to what Surflex 2000 has designed. It absolutely makes a difference, and any solution should be free to add for existing Prusa XL customers, even if that means they have to ship out required hardware. In its current state, there's just simply no way I could recommend the XL, not unless you're really patient or you like to tinker. I'm hopeful that Prusa can sort these issues soon, and I hope some of the suggestions in this video might even help them. This is currently the only 3D printer available with a tool changer, so let's hope the XL reaches that potential. Like the Mini, is this just an early adopter thing? Am I being too harsh? Am I not being harsh enough? Let me know down in the comments section. I'm not going to end with happy 3D printing, instead just state that I hope there's an update video for the XL from me in the future with some good news. G'day, it's Michael again. If you liked the video, then please click like. If you want to see more content like this in future, click subscribe and make sure you click on the bell to receive every notification. If you really want to support the channel and see exclusive content, become a patron. Visit my Patreon page. See you next time.